Imagine New York City in the late 1800s. The streets are noisy with horse hooves and iron wheels. Carriages rumble over cobblestones. Street vendors call out prices for oysters, newspapers, and fresh bread. The smell of coal smoke blends with sea air drifting in from the harbor. On Fifth Avenue rise long rows of brownstone mansions. Their windows glow at dusk, and their doors open to the city's most powerful people: bankers, merchants, railroad owners, and their families. This is a world ruled by social rules as strict as iron bars. Getting invited to the right party matters as much as having money in the bank. And at the very top of this shimmering world stands one woman, Mrs. Caroline Astor. People would later call her the Queen of New York High Society. But queens are not born, they are made. Mrs. Caroline Astor's road to power began long before she wore the crown of society. It started with a name, Caroline Webster Schermerhorn, and with a family that had been in New York since the city was only a small Dutch settlement called New Amsterdam. Old roots, new power. Caroline Webster Schermerhorn was born in 1830 into the respected Schermerhorn family. Her ancestors were part of the original Dutch settlers who came to Manhattan in the 1600s. These early Schermerhorns were not only brave, they were smart. They bought land and held onto it even when times were hard. Over generations, that land turned into a fortune as New York grew into a major city. By Caroline's birth, the Schermerhorns owned large pieces of Manhattan that would one day be worth unimaginable sums. Caroline's father, Abraham Schermerhorn, was a shipping magnate. His business connected New York to the world. His ships carried cloth, tea, spices, and luxury goods across the ocean. If you lived in New York then and enjoyed a fine silk dress or a delicate porcelain teacup, there was a good chance it had traveled on one of Abraham's ships. He was wealthy, influential, and respected. At home, the Schermerhorns lived in comfort, surrounded by servants, art, and carefully chosen furniture from Europe. Caroline learned the lessons that mattered in her world: how to speak softly but confidently, how to host guests, how to move with grace, and how to keep her family's reputation spotless. In 1850, when Caroline was still young, Abraham Schermerhorn died. His fortune did not vanish. It passed in part to Caroline. This was unusual for the time. Most women depended fully on fathers or husbands. But Caroline had her own money and her own independence. That independence would matter later, when she faced rivals, family drama, and enormous change. A grand match, the Astors. In 1853, Caroline married William Backhouse Astor Jr. If the Schermerhorns were old New York, the Astors were old money by the mid-1800s. The first Astor, John Jacob Astor, had come to America with little and built a fortune in furs and, most importantly, in real estate. The Astors bought land the way ship captains bought sails, constantly and with purpose. Over time, their properties turned them into one of the richest families in the country. The marriage of Caroline and William Backhouse Astor Jr. was more than romance. It was a union of two powerful names. As a wedding gift, William's father, William Astor Sr., gave the young couple a stately brownstone mansion at Fifth Avenue and 34th Street. Fifth Avenue was quickly becoming the place to live, and their home stood right where the city's heartbeat could be felt. At first, Mrs. Caroline Astor lived quietly, focusing on her children and household. She was not yet the woman who would shape New York's social ladder. But everything changed when William Astor Sr. died and left an enormous inheritance. About $45 million, which would be well over $1 billion today. This inheritance didn't just lift the family higher, it placed Mrs. Caroline Astor in a league of her own. She had wealth, name, and now a clear path to power. Becoming the Mrs. Astor. In high society, small details carry big meaning. A calling card, a guest list, a seat at dinner. Each one whispers who you are and how much you matter. Caroline understood this language better than anyone. After her father-in-law's death, she began to reshape her role. She didn't want to be just Mrs. Astor. She wanted to be the Mrs. Astor, the single, unquestioned leader of New York society. Her brownstone became the private stage where she would direct her performance. She ordered a full redecoration, Walls glowed with gilded patterns. Mirrors reflected candlelight like pools of warm fire. The drawing room shimmered with rococo swirls. The dining room took on the soft curves and delicate lines of the Louis XV style, filled with French antiques and china that clinked like tiny bells. But the heart of the home was the ballroom. It could hold 400 guests. That number, 400, became a secret code. It was the maximum number of people Mrs. Astor believed truly counted in New York society. With her ally and friend Ward McAllister, Mrs. Astor shaped the social map of the city. Together, they talked about manners, taste, and who belonged. Ward McAllister was witty, charming, and not afraid to speak his mind. He helped Mrs. Astor popularize the idea of the 400, the curated list of people who were in. If you weren't invited to Mrs. Astor's ball, many believed you simply didn't matter in that world. It sounds harsh, and it was. But those were the rules of the Gilded Age. Beauty, money, behavior, and connections decided almost everything. How social power worked. To understand Mrs. Caroline Astor's power, you have to understand the game she played. High society worked like a careful dance with steps you had to learn. First, there were calling hours. Ladies set specific afternoons when visitors could leave cards on silver trays by the door. If Mrs. Astor returned your call, you were noticed. If she did not, you were invisible. Then there were invitations. Being invited to a dinner or a ball meant someone of rank saw you as worthy. Being invited by Mrs. Astor meant you had reached the center of the circle. There were dress codes. At her events, ladies wore gowns of silk and satin with jewels that caught the candlelight like stars. Men wore strict evening dress, black tailcoat, white waistcoat, and gleaming shoes. There were menus and music. Dinners might begin with oysters, followed by delicate soups, fish, roasts, and pastries. Orchestras played waltzes and polkas. Servants moved like a quiet tide, refilling glasses and clearing plates with effortless timing. And there were seating charts. Where you sat told a story about your place. Close to Mrs. Astor meant favored. Far away meant you still had a long climb ahead. Mrs. Astor didn't just host parties, she ran a system that rewarded manners, loyalty, and taste. Many people think social power is shallow. In her hands, it became strategy. The Summer Kingdom. Beechwood. Winters were for New York. Summers were for Newport, Rhode Island. In the late 1800s, Newport was where America's richest families escaped the heat and competed, quietly or loudly, for status. Here, along the rocky coast, grand mansions rose like palaces. The sea wind smelled of salt and roses. Lawns ran down to the cliffs, and waves thundered below. In 1881, Mrs. Caroline Astor bought Beechwood, a mansion that would become her summer palace. To make it worthy of her rule, she hired the celebrated architect Richard Morris Hunt. He expanded Beechwood and added a ballroom that could hold 400 people, keeping to Mrs. Astor's signature number. Rooms were dressed in silk and velvet. Marble fireplaces glowed with reflected candle flames. Chandeliers spilled warm light like rain. At Beechwood, the social season ran like clockwork. Afternoons might bring lawn games, tennis, and carriage rides along the cliffs. Evenings brought dinners, concerts, and masked balls. The orchestra tuned up. The doors opened, the invited swept in, and the excluded remained on the outside, listening to the music drift over the hedges. For 8 weeks a year, if you were anyone in Newport, you waited for Mrs. Astor's invitation. There was joy at Beechwood, the joy of celebration and beauty, but there was also tension. New families with brand new fortunes wanted in. Old families guarded the gates. Mrs. Astor stood at the crossroads, deciding who crossed the threshold. Old money versus new money. The Gilded Age was a time of breathtaking change. Railroads stretched across the continent. Steel built the skeletons of new skyscrapers. Factories produced goods faster than ever. New fortunes appeared almost overnight. But the old families, the Schermerhorns, the Astors, and others, believed that money alone did not make a person refined. This is where Mrs. Caroline Astor drew a line. She valued tradition, good manners, and careful taste. She wasn't against change. After all, she lived in a city that reinvented itself constantly. but she believed that true status had to be earned over time. This belief put her at odds with some newcomers who wanted quick acceptance. There were famous social clashes. One of the most dramatic involved the Vanderbilt family, who had massive railroad wealth but struggled to gain acceptance into the highest circles. Mrs. Astor's careful control of invitations sent a message. Money could open many doors, but not all doors, and not immediately. In this world, a single dance invitation could mean the difference between respect and ridicule, and Mrs. Astor held the pen that wrote those invitations. Trouble on Fifth Avenue, change, finally knocked on Mrs. Astor's own door, literally. Her nephew, William Waldorf Astor, tore down his mansion next to hers and built the Grand Waldorf Hotel. Hotels brought crowds, noise, and strangers. For Mrs. Astor, who guarded privacy and elegance, this felt like an invasion. The hotel towered over her brownstone, casting it into shadow and filling the block with wagons and visitors. After 40 years in the house at Fifth Avenue and 34th Street, Mrs. Astor decided to move. But she did not retreat, she advanced. With her son, John Jacob Astor IV, she helped create a rival hotel, the Astoria. The Waldorf and the Astoria eventually connected, forming the famous Waldorf Astoria, a symbol of luxury known around the world. Even so, Mrs. Astor needed a home that matched her vision of dignity and grandeur. Once again, she turned to Richard Morris Hunt to design something truly extraordinary. The Great Double Mansion, in 1896 at Fifth Avenue and 65th Street, facing Central Park, the Astor Double Mansion opened its doors. It was a structure of remarkable size and beauty, designed in the style of French chateaus. The facade rose with strong lines and carved stone. Inside, space unfolded like a royal procession. Vestibule, grand hall, sweeping marble stairs beneath a skylight, and rooms laid out for elegance and command. The double mansion was really two homes joined together, one for Mrs. Caroline Astor and one for her son, John Jacob Astor IV. This arrangement allowed them to share grandeur while keeping their households distinct. It also sent a message. The Astor line was strong, united, and at the pinnacle of society. Guests arriving at Mrs. Astor's entrance stepped into a world of planning and beauty. The marble floors seemed to glow. Statues stood watch along the walls. Fresh flowers perfumed the air. Servants guided visitors with perfect calm, collecting coats and hats, and then leading the way. There was a reception room where guests waited to be announced. There was a drawing room for conversation, upholstered in silk and set with delicate tables holding porcelain and crystal. There was a dining room where long dinners were served under the gaze of art and sculpture. And then there was the ballroom, a soaring 4-story space open to galleries above, where music drifted down like mist. When candles and chandeliers were lit, the room felt like a sunrise captured inside stone. In this house, Mrs. Astor reigned. She stood not only as a hostess, but as the keeper of a tradition. If the city outside raced forward with factories, electric lights, and the rush of modern life, the rooms within the double mansion held stillness, order, and grace. What it meant to be in. People sometimes ask, why did anyone care so much about parties and lists? The answer is that in the Gilded Age, society was a kind of business. Being accepted by Mrs. Astor could help a man find investors or a woman arrange a strong marriage. It could raise a family's standing and open doors to clubs, boards, and partnerships. Social success could lead to real-world power. But social life was also about storytelling. People wanted to believe they lived in a civilization of beauty and good taste, not just factories and money. Mrs. Astor curated that dream. She created a stage where the city's leaders could pretend for an evening that America was as polished as any European court. The work behind the beauty. Behind every polished event stood work, endless work. Weeks before a major ball, Mrs. Astor's staff would begin preparations. Cooks ordered ingredients for a dozen courses. Florists planned arrangements of roses, lilies, and ferns. Footmen practiced the order of service, so plates would glide from kitchen to table without a single crash or delay. Tailors and dressmakers were busy too. Ladies visited fittings for gowns of satin, silk, and lace. Jewels were polished, shoes were shined until they reflected faces like mirrors. Men checked that their gloves were spotless and their shirt fronts sharp with starch. Invitations were written on heavy paper with graceful script. Each envelope carried the weight of hope or fear. Messengers delivered them, and the city held its breath. Who was invited? Who was left out? The newspapers sometimes whispered about the lists, and families read those whispers with nervous eyes. On the night of an event, gas lamps glowed along Fifth Avenue. Carriages lined up. Footsteps echoed on stone. The doors opened, and the world Mrs. Astor built came alive. The orchestra began, the dancers took their places, and somewhere, in the hush before the first notes, Mrs. Caroline Astor looked over her kingdom and saw that the evening would be perfect. A private person in a public role. Although she ruled public life, Mrs. Caroline Astor was, in many ways, private. She did not seek the stage the way some people do today. She believed in restraint, in not showing too much of oneself. She rarely spoke to reporters. She let her choices speak. Who she visited, who she invited, what causes she supported. People who met Mrs. Astor remembered her poise, her calm voice, and the way she made a room feel still. She could be warm to those she respected, and cool to those she felt were bold or careless. She believed that influence came from self-control, not noise. In an age of bragging and sudden wealth, her quiet strength set her apart. The city transforms. While Mrs. Astor perfected her world, the city outside transformed. Electricity lit streets where gas lamps once flickered. Telephone wires connected neighborhoods. Elevated railways rattled above the avenues. New immigrants arrived daily, carrying dreams and building futures. The skyline climbed higher. Some people said the old rules no longer fit the new city. They believed Americans should celebrate energy and invention more than etiquette and elegance. Others looked to Mrs. Astor as a steady anchor, proof that even in change, there could be order and beauty. In a way, New York needed both, the rush of progress and the balance of tradition, the cost of the crown. To hold power is to carry weight. Mrs. Astor maintained her position for decades, but it demanded perfection. There could be no sloppy event, no careless feud, no public embarrassment. Every invitation was a decision. Every decision had consequences. Friends expected favors, rivals looked for mistakes. The crown of society was not just a jewel, it was a burden that required focus and discipline. And then, when it seemed she would rule forever, life shifted with a single step on a marble stair. The beginning of the end. One day, inside the double mansion, Mrs. Caroline Astor slipped and fell. Marble is beautiful, but it is not forgiving. The fall left her with a serious head injury. She tried to continue, tried to host, to plan, to be the center of the room, but something had changed. Her strength faltered. Her memory did not always serve her. The calendar of events grew thinner. The nights became quieter. The grand house felt too large. Servants moved more slowly. Doors that once swung open stayed closed. Friends lowered their voices when they spoke her name. The queen was still alive, but her kingdom felt distant, as if wrapped in fog. In those quiet rooms, Mrs. Astor faced what all rulers face, the truth that no one can hold a crown forever. The queen grows silent. After her fall, Mrs. Caroline Astor slowly withdrew from the world she had once ruled. For years, the grand double mansion had been filled with light and laughter. Now, its echoing halls felt still, almost sacred. The chandeliers gathered dust. The orchestra no longer played. The carriages that once lined the street no longer stopped at her door. Her family tried to keep her comfortable. Servants continued their duties with quiet respect. But everyone in New York knew the truth. Mrs. Astor's reign was ending. Those who remembered her prime spoke of her as if she were royalty who had gone into hiding. The queen does not receive visitors anymore, they would whisper. Outside her mansion, the city marched into the future. Skyscrapers rose higher than anyone had imagined. Electric lights replaced gas lamps. Telephones rang in offices and homes. Automobiles began appearing on the streets, startling horses and pedestrians alike. It was a new world, faster, louder, more open, and one that no longer played by Mrs. Astor's rules. Inside her home, though, time stood still. The walls were lined with portraits of ancestors who had founded dynasties. Her ballroom remained perfectly preserved, its mirrors reflecting a ghostly memory of the parties that had once defined New York society. Sometimes Mrs. Astor would ask about old friends, unaware that some had passed away. Sometimes she would talk about her next ball, even though no such event was planned. To the servants who loved her, it was heartbreaking. The woman who had built New York's social order now lived in a world that existed only in her mind. The last interview. In October 1908, not long before her death, Mrs. Caroline Astor agreed to one final interview with The Delineator, a popular magazine for women. It was rare for her to speak publicly, but perhaps she knew it was her last chance to share her thoughts. She spoke softly but clearly, reflecting on her life, her choices, and the future of society. Her words revealed both wisdom and humility. She said, "I am not vain enough to think New York will not be able to get along very well without me. Many women will rise up to take my place, but I hope my influence will be felt in one thing, and that is in discouraging the undignified methods employed by certain New York women to attract a following." It was a gentle warning, not just to her peers, but to future generations. She had lived in an age where reputation and dignity were everything. She feared that the coming age, one driven by wealth, publicity, and speed, would forget those values. Her final message wasn't about jewels, mansions, or money. It was about self-respect. Soon after, Mrs. Caroline Astor grew weaker. In late October 1908, surrounded by family and servants, she passed away quietly in her sleep. She was 78 years old. Her death was headline news. Newspapers across the country wrote about the end of an era. For nearly 50 years, Mrs. Astor had shaped American society. She had defined what it meant to be refined, fashionable, and elegant. Now, her throne was empty, a son's tragic fate. After Mrs. Astor's passing, her son John Jacob Astor IV became the head of the family. He inherited both halves of the great Fifth Avenue mansion and the beloved summer estate, Beechwood. John Jacob was charming, intelligent, and creative. He was an inventor, a businessman, and a writer. He modernized his mother's mansion, combining the two halves into one grand home, and updating it with the latest technology of the early 1900s, electricity, telephones, and elevators. He also continued to host parties, though the world had changed. The grand balls of his mother's day were fading. New York society was beginning to mix old money with new. Artists, actors, and even journalists were now being invited into circles that Mrs. Astor would never have approved of. Still, John Jacob Astor IV carried himself with the grace and confidence of his lineage. In 1911, he remarried, taking a young bride named Madeline Force, who was nearly 30 years younger than he was. Their marriage caused scandal in society pages. People whispered that it was improper for a man of his age and class to marry so soon after divorcing his first wife. But John Jacob was not a man to hide from gossip. In 1912, he and Madeline decided to travel to Europe for their honeymoon. After several months abroad, they booked passage home on a brand new ship, the largest and most luxurious ever built. Its name was RMS Titanic, the Titanic disaster. The Titanic set sail from Southampton, England on April 10, 1912. It was a floating palace, marble staircases, grand dining rooms, crystal chandeliers, and cabins so elegant they rivaled any mansion on land. For John Jacob Astor IV, the ship must have felt familiar, a new world echoing the opulence of his mother's. When the ship struck an iceberg in the freezing waters of the North Atlantic on the night of April 14th, chaos followed. Passengers scrambled to lifeboats. The freezing wind howled through the darkness. John Jacob Astor IV helped his young wife Madeline, who was pregnant, onto a lifeboat. Witnesses later said he asked calmly, "May I accompany my wife?" The officer shook his head. "Women and children first." John Jacob nodded, accepted the rule, and stepped back. He was last seen standing beside the railing, watching the lifeboats drift away under the stars. The enormous ship groaned and tilted. Then it broke apart and disappeared into the black water. John Jacob Astor IV was one of more than 1,500 people who died that night. His body was recovered days later, identified by the initials on his clothing and a gold watch still ticking in his pocket. The tragedy shocked the world. For New York, it was more than a disaster. It was the symbolic end of an age. The Titanic had carried not just lives, but an entire way of life, confidence, wealth, and the belief that progress could conquer anything. Now, that illusion had sunk beneath the sea, a changing city. After the deaths of Mrs. Caroline Astor and John Jacob, Astor IV, the world they represented began to fade. New York was no longer a small, closed circle of families. Immigrants poured in from every corner of the world. Industry boomed. The skyline reached upward, each new building higher than the last. The city of elegance was transforming into the city of ambition. By the 1920s, the jazz age had arrived. Young people danced in nightclubs instead of ballrooms. Women cut their hair short and wore dresses that shocked their grandmothers. Men traded top hats for fedoras. The rules of Mrs. Astor's world, quiet dignity, social rank, and strict manners, were replaced by new values, energy, creativity, and freedom. But though her world disappeared, her influence never truly died. The Waldorf Astoria Hotel, once the scene of her family's rivalry, became one of the most famous hotels in history. It hosted presidents, movie stars, and world leaders. Even after the original building was demolished and replaced by the Empire State Building, the name Waldorf Astoria lived on in a new location, still a symbol of luxury and prestige. Her summer home, Beechwood, survived too. Though no longer owned by the Astors, it still stands on the Newport coast, its windows overlooking the same rolling waves that once sparkled beneath the light of her summer balls. And in Manhattan, where her great double mansion once stood, a synagogue called Temple Emmanuel now occupies the land. It is one of the largest and most beautiful in the world. A fitting replacement, perhaps, for a house that was once dedicated to another kind of reverence, the worship of beauty and status. The legacy of a queen. So what, in the end, was Mrs. Caroline Astor's legacy? She didn't write laws. She didn't build railroads or invent machines. Her power came from something invisible, the ability to define what was in and what was out. She turned social life into an art form and herself into a legend. In doing so, she helped shape how America still thinks about class and culture. When we talk about high society, influencers, or exclusive guest lists, we are, in a way, continuing her traditions. She understood that image could be as powerful as money, a lesson that echoes today in everything from fashion weeks to celebrity galas. But Mrs. Astor's influence went deeper than glamour. She believed that wealth should come with responsibility, that the upper class should behave with grace, give to charity, and serve as examples of good manners. To her, elegance wasn't about showing off. It was about control, refinement, and restraint. In that sense, she stood as a kind of moral compass during a time of excess. The Gilded Age was full of greed and extravagance, but Mrs. Astor tried to add order and meaning to it. She believed that civilization depended on people who could rise above selfishness and set a higher standard. Even her famous list, the 400, was, at its heart, her way of bringing structure to chaos. She once said that a society without rules would be like a dinner without order, where no one knows where to sit. Echoes of the Gilded Age. More than 100 years later, you can still find traces of Mrs. Caroline Astor's world in New York. Walk down Fifth Avenue, and you'll see marble buildings with carved facades that look like palaces. Step into a luxury hotel, and you'll feel the same spirit of opulence that she once embodied. Even in modern parties, from fashion shows to charity galas, there's an unspoken hierarchy, a sense of who gets invited and who doesn't. The velvet ropes outside exclusive events are the modern-day version of Mrs. Astor's guest lists. She might not recognize today's world of selfies and social media, but she would understand the desire behind it, the wish to be seen, admired, and accepted. The difference is that in her time, acceptance came not from followers or fame, but from refinement and reputation. There's something almost haunting about that contrast. Mrs. Astor built her world with patience, tradition, and quiet influence. Today's world moves at lightning speed, built on attention and novelty. Yet both chase the same dream, to belong among the elite, to have one's name spoken with admiration. The woman behind the crown. It's easy to see Mrs. Caroline Astor as a symbol, the queen of society, the face of an era. But she was also human. She loved her children deeply. She endured the pain of aging, of losing her strength, and finally of losing her son in one of the greatest tragedies of the century. Those who knew her said she had moments of kindness that didn't make the newspapers. She quietly donated to charities and churches. She supported artists and young women who needed guidance. She could be strict, but she wasn't cruel. Her standards came from a belief that life should be lived beautifully, not just in appearance, but in behavior. In her last years, when illness dimmed her memory, it's said that she sometimes asked about her next party, as if the grand season were just about to begin again. Perhaps in her heart, she never left that world of music and candlelight. Perhaps she still heard the echoes of violins and laughter drifting down her marble halls. The end of an era. By the time Mrs. Astor's story ended, America had changed forever. The Gilded Age, with its gowns, carriages, and glittering mansions, gave way to the modern world of machines, motion, and electricity. The families she had once deemed new money became the old names of the next century. The Vanderbilts, Carnegies, and Rockefellers built legacies of their own. Women's roles began to change. The vote, education, and independence slowly opened to them. And yet, the memory of Mrs. Caroline Astor remained. Writers, historians, and filmmakers would return to her name again and again, seeing in her life a symbol of both grace and vanity, both beauty and fragility. In truth, her story is not just about one woman. It's about the rise and fall of an age, the marble staircases she climbed, the chandeliers that lit her face, the music that played in her ballroom. They were all part of a larger dream, that America could create its own kind of royalty, the eternal queen. Today, as you walk through New York City, you can still sense Mrs. Astor's shadow among the skyscrapers. She may not have left behind castles or crowns, but she left behind ideas about taste, ambition, and the desire to stand out in a crowd. She reminds us that power doesn't always come from laws or armies. Sometimes it comes from presence, the quiet strength of someone who knows who they are and what they represent. When you hear the words Gilded Age, you might think of wealth and luxury, but behind the gold surface was a woman who gave it shape. Mrs. Caroline Astor wasn't just the Queen of New York. She was its mirror, reflecting the city's dreams, its pride, and its endless hunger to be the best. Her story ends more than a century ago, but her spirit lives on in every grand ballroom, every gala, every headline that whispers about who made the guest list and who didn't. Because in the end, history isn't just about what we build, it's about who defines what matters. And for half a century, Mrs. Caroline Astor defined what mattered in New York.